on September 13th. Pursuant to policy, my office was contacted shortly after the September 13th incident, and Lancaster County detectives took command of the investigation that evening. Over the past few weeks, detectives have conducted a complete and professional inquiry into this matter. I have been fully debriefed throughout the investigation and have completed my review of the investigative materials. To summarize this incident, a 27-year-old man identified as Ricardo Muñoz was shot and killed by an officer who responded to a 911 call in the 300 block of Laurel Street. Upon arrival, the officer was immediately confronted by Muñoz, who ran out of a home and charged the officer while brandishing a large knife. The officer fired 4 shots as he was being chased. All 4 struck Muñoz, who died at the scene. The nature of the injuries from the gunshots immediately rendered Muñoz beyond resuscitation. In any officer-involved shooting in Lancaster County, I am tasked to render a decision as to whether the use of force used in the incident was justified under the law. Based on my review of the facts and the applicable law, there is no question that the officer was justified in the use of deadly force against Ricardo Muñoz on September 13th. The applicable law under Title 18, Section 508 provides an officer is justified in using deadly force when the officer reasonably believes such force is necessary to prevent death or serious bodily injury to himself or another person. Here, the officer's belief that Muñoz presented an imminent threat to his life and that deadly force was necessary was beyond reasonable, as the officer was being chased by Muñoz with a knife overhead. Today, we will be releasing several photos, videos, and the audio recording of the 911 call, which resulted in the officer's presence on Laurel Street that day. Before I address the facts and the evidence pertinent to this case in more detail, I want to publicly offer our condolences to the family of Ricardo Muñoz. We realize that their lives are now changed forever through no fault of their own. Earlier this morning, we were able to meet with the family and their attorneys privately to discuss our findings and my conclusion. We shared with them what we will share with you now. My team of county detectives, led by Chief County Detective Kent Schweitzer, collected evidence, conducted interviews, compiled reports, made numerous other investigative efforts to provide me with a clear picture of what took place on September 13th. The officer involved in the shooting was also interviewed that very evening. I've reviewed reports submitted by the Lancaster City police officers who arrived on scene that night. It should be noted that our investigation and my determination does not include any internal review of policy that would be conducted by the Lancaster City Police Department. Some key factors in my determination that the officer was justified in his use of deadly force are: Muñoz responded to the officer's mere presence on the scene by charging the officer with a knife. There was no interaction or exchange of words between Muñoz and the officer prior to Muñoz's blitz assault on the officer. When Muñoz suddenly emerged from the doorway of 306 Laurel Street, Muñoz clearly held a knife, and the officer saw it at that time. Muñoz immediately and without warning charged and chased the officer, and the officer ran for his life. After running a short distance, the officer looked back and saw that Muñoz was still rapidly pursuing him. So in that very instant, he turned to the right and he confirmed that the threat was imminent. In that instant, Muñoz was right behind him with the knife raised over above his head. The time that elapsed from when Muñoz appeared in the doorway to the officer firing shots was a mere 4 seconds. At the time shots were fired, Muñoz was less than 7 feet away and likely closer. I want to take a moment to clarify this situation simply does not call for de-escalation tactics or less than lethal force, such as a taser. The law simply does not require an officer to use less than lethal force when faced with imminent death or serious bodily injury to themselves or another. And that is exactly what this officer faced. In this scenario, there was a 4-second interaction where the officer essentially runs for his life. So he retreats, he confirms that the threat is still imminent, and he reacts by firing. There was no time or opportunity for de-escalation. For those asking, why not shoot someone in the leg? This is not how officers are trained. Officers are trained to shoot at center mass, and they're trained to meet deadly force with deadly force until the threat is neutralized. And that is exactly what the officer did here. He did as he was trained to do. And I would submit to you that 4 shots was restraint given the imminent threat that Muñoz faced that very day. Whether it be a police officer or a citizen, they would have been justified in using deadly force in that situation. Again, the police officer's belief that deadly force was necessary was patently reasonable and clearly prevented serious bodily injury to himself or another person, and also potentially others in the area had the officer not responded with lethal force. So at this point, we're going to display a map on the screen of the area that we're discussing here today. If you look at the screen, Laurel Street runs from the top of the screen to the bottom of the screen. On the left hand of Laurel Street, we have 4 noted designations. The first at the top of the screen is 236 Laurel Street. That is the residence where the 911 call was placed. Working towards the bottom, the next highlight there is 306 Laurel Street, where Muñoz came out of the door. The next is 310 Laurel Street. That's where shots were fired and where Muñoz came to rest. And finally, at the bottom of the screen shows where the police officer parked in an alley known as Alley 114 prior to walking up on the sidewalk. The 911 call here was placed at 4:13 p.m. Prior to this call being placed, Muñoz is seen here in a photo walking on Laurel Street as he's approaching his sister's house, and this was at approximately 4:10 p.m. As you can see, he's carrying a backpack and heading south towards 236 Laurel Street. At 4:13 p.m., Muñoz's sister called 911 from her home at 236 Laurel Street, requesting police assistance. We will have the transcript of this call available, and Brett, if you could play the call at this time.
Lancaster, County 911, do you need police, fire, ambulance? Hello? Hello, do you need police, fire, ambulance? Right now, police assistance. Okay, what's the address? 306 Laurel Street. 306 Laurel Street? What township, city, or borough are you in?
Lancaster.
And the phone number you're calling from?
717.
Okay, tell me exactly what's going on.
My mom needs some assistance. Her son is being very aggressive and he needs help.
Is it your brother?
Yeah. He has mental problems.
Okay.
And she needs help. At least bring him to the hospital or something. She's here at my house right now.
Okay, what does he have? Is he...
He's schizophrenic. Yeah, bipolar schizophrenic.
Okay. And is he there? Is he at the 306 Laurel Street now?
Yeah, he's in between 236, this is where I am, and the other in her house.
Okay, and what is he doing?
So he punched the car, the inside of the car, and he's trying to break in to the door to the house also.
Okay.
So she's afraid to just go home with him now.
Right, I understand. And what is his name?
Ricardo. That's an M-U-N-O-Z.
N-U-N-O-Z?
M as in Mary,
Munoz.
M-U-N-O-Z.
Okay. So Ricardo Muñoz?
Yeah.
And what's his date of birth? Okay. And what is your name? Same last name?
Yeah.
Okay. And does he have any weapons on him?
Not that I know of.
Okay. Has he been drinking or doing drugs?
No.
Okay. Alright, we'll send someone out. They'll be there as soon as they can. If anything changes, give us a call back, okay?
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Bye.
As you heard, the caller requested police assistance. Police were dispatched to 306 Laurel Street. An officer arrived on scene at approximately 4:25 p.m. The officer parked his cruiser several houses away, as you saw, in an alley known as Alley 114. The officer got out of his cruiser and started walking towards 306 Laurel Street, at which time he turned on his body camera. We're going to play the footage from that body cam from the moment the camera began recording to immediately prior to the shooting. We've stopped the video just prior to the first shot being fired. You're going to see the video in real time first, followed by a repeat of the video in half speed with certain frames emphasized.
Coming your way. 1, 2, 2, 1.
Where'd they go? Get back, get back.
The investigation revealed the following, not all of which is depicted or easily heard in the video. When the officer encountered Munoz's mother at the doorway, she told Munoz that the police had arrived. The officer then heard very loud footsteps and described it as if someone was running upstairs. The officer backed up as a result. In our interview with Munoz's mother, she confirmed that after she told her son that the police had arrived, Munoz ran upstairs and retrieved a knife and ran quickly back down the stairs. As Munoz approached the door, she reacted by saying, "Oh my God," in Spanish. As Munoz is approaching the door, he can be heard yelling to his mother, "Get the F back." The officer tells her, "Get back, get back." Munoz again says, "Get the F back." By the officer's account, he did not even see Munoz before Munoz suddenly appeared and ran out of the doorway. The knife that Munoz brandished was recovered by his body. And we have a photo of the hunting style knife. The following happened after the shooting. The officer radioed that shots had been fired, and he requested EMS to the scene within a minute of the shooting. The officer approached Muñoz and ordered bystanders to get back. In order to render aid to Muñoz, the firing officer picked up his gloves from the sidewalk, which had been dropped when Muñoz pursued him. 2 additional officers then arrived and approached Muñoz. Meanwhile, a 3rd responding officer escorted the firing officer away from the scene. The 2 other remaining officers tended to Muñoz about 2 minutes after the shots were fired. The officers then turned Muñoz over so they could render aid, and a trauma first aid kit was provided. However, the officers immediately concluded that Muñoz was beyond help, and an EMS crew summoned to the scene was canceled. This all occurred within 4 minutes after the last shot was fired. At 4:45 p.m., our office was notified, and a team of county detectives was sent to the area. An on-scene investigation was conducted. There were numerous photographs and measurements taken. Physical evidence was collected and preserved, and people in the area were interviewed. After the scene was fully processed, the Lancaster County Coroner's Office took Muñoz's body into their custody. This occurred approximately 4 hours after the shooting incident. With respect to the officer's identity, I will not release the name of the officer involved in the shooting, as the shooting was deemed to be justified. If our independent investigation would have determined that a crime was committed and charges were warranted, then the officer's name would have been released at the time of the announcement of the charges. That is clearly not the case here. Given the violence that erupted immediately after this incident, there certainly are safety considerations as well for the officer, and that alone would outweigh any public interest in releasing the identity officer, especially where the officer is cleared of any wrongdoing. In closing, I want to recognize that whenever a police officer uses deadly force, it is a traumatic and emotionally charged event in our community. Certainly for the families directly impacted, for the neighborhood, for the entire police community, and the officer involved. An officer-involved shooting is the most traumatic event an officer will encounter during service, and our thoughts are with this officer as he continues to cope with the events of September 13th. It is my continued hope that any reaction to the determination announced today is peaceful and with regard for the safety of our neighbors and peace in our neighborhoods. I'll gladly take questions at this time.
Heather, what was the officer told about the house he was arriving at? Was he told that Ricardo Muñoz had documented mental illness?
So that's a good question. And much of what dispatch told him was actually contained in that call itself. So some of this will sound repetitive, but after verbally being told some of the information that was in that call and being dispatched to 306 Laurel, when he was at a stationary position, he actually reviewed the written comments from dispatch, which are available to him through his computer system. The written comments indicated, and again, he was already verbally told this, but that the subject was very aggressive with his mother, was schizophrenic and bipolar, had punched the inside of a car, and was trying to break into his mother's home. The officer was told that the subject had no weapons, was not drinking, or on drugs. The officer was provided, again, with a name and date of birth. He was also made aware that the subject had summary warrants at the time, but no warrants in AOPC, or which would be the equivalent of the Court of Common Pleas in Lancaster County. He would not have had, the arriving officer certainly would not have had any information on any prior criminal involvement by Muñoz, excuse me.
Yes. Is there any situation like this where somebody else, we heard from the mayor, where someone in addition to a police officer is brought into a situation like this, in other words, a social worker?
In Lancaster County, are you
Yeah.
asking? I mean, I'm aware that Lancaster City employs a social worker, but the scope of her employment and what exactly her job description is and what that requires, I wouldn't know. I think Lancaster City would be better equipped to handle that question.
And the call was made tonight. There was some talk about
During our investigation, we did determine that in an interview with the one sister, that she indicated she had called Lebanon County Crisis. We were not able to confirm with Lebanon County Crisis that that call happened, although we don't disbelieve that call was placed. There was then another call placed to the non-emergency number, which would be essentially the front desk at Lancaster City Bureau of Police, and that call did in fact happen.
What was told in that call?
So the Sister Relentis was inquiring about the situation and what to do. Now, she was not at the address where the other sister was, Deborah, at 236 Laurel Street, so she was not on scene. The officer provided her with kind of an overview of what the policies and procedures are, asked whether she wanted to be transferred to police dispatch, and she declined at that time.
But those calls happened at the same time. Those sisters were essentially calling at the same time.
There were 3 calls. So the sister not on scene called Lebanon County Crisis, then called police non-emergency. The sister on scene at 236 Laurel Street called 911. Virtually, yes, kind of in the span of minutes.
no call was made to a Lancaster crisis intervention.
Not to our knowledge. Well, we got limited information from Crisis. There was no indication of a call on September 13th.
They've been called, when were they called?
No, I mean, in regards to certain mental health history.
District Attorney, the family's really been emphatic that Ricardo never posed a threat to them, and that their purpose in calling was to get him involuntarily committed to the hospital. So in your investigation, and it's clear in the 911 tape as well, that at times you're mentioning that that's what they're trying to do is get him to the hospital. With your investigation, what did you learn about the officer's purpose and motive when he went there? What was his plan, and what was he planning to do?
So I can tell you that the call for police assistance was absolutely a police assistance call. In other words, police were needed to respond to that call. In any city across the country, police would have responded to that call. You heard that he was being described as being very aggressive, that the mother was afraid of him, and that he was trying to break into her house. I can tell you that there's certainly nothing unreasonable about the officer's approach. Here, he did not arrive with lights and sirens on. They were off. He parked a good distance away. He parked out of the view of the occupants of that home. He approached on foot, calmly. He was able to look at the situation. He heard that another officer was 6 blocks away, so he knew that backup was coming. He was able to relay to arriving officers that he did not see anything at the time. So all of that is very reasonable. In his statement, the officer indicated that due to the circumstances of the call, he decided to proceed to the doorway. And that was out of care and concern for those that made the call.
Again, I've only heard the 911 call once so far, but I've heard them say that we're trying to get him to the hospital. And so, again, did that factor into the officer's mission, providing the role of getting a person with a serious diagnosed mental illness to a hospital for care? Was that part of the overall plan, or was his role something else?
I think it's even more basic than that. Police were dispatched to an appropriate call for the police to respond, and he arrived. That's all he had the chance to
What
do.
were they responding to? Were they responding to
The request for police assistance.
what kind of assistance?
Again, if you listen to the call, the subject is being described as very aggressive, that the mother's afraid of him, and that he's trying to break into the
So
house.
it sounds like it did-
Regardless of whether that's his mother's house, when someone's trying to break in, that's a potential burglary. Again, he only had the opportunity to arrive, nothing else. There was no interchange, no exchange of words. He arrived. Next question.
Do you support anything in the future in in this type of call, and it's a difficult situation because the officer is concerned, obviously, about people in the home, being hurt. So he can't really sit in a car necessarily and wait for something to happen. He's been criticized if something would happen in the house. But is there a policy to look at where when somebody's calling and saying somebody has schizophrenia, family member, to bring somebody else in from a hospital, push that call yourself to call in someone with that type of background, psychological background?
So I'm not aware of any policy that Lancaster City Police would have, but I think this instance, is a baseline for a discussion. That's probably a worthy discussion to be had. But respectfully, I think those involved in BHDS, those involved with crisis, the police department, the mayor, I think they need to have that conversation.
Heather, you said the officer parked a little bit away, arrived with no sirens. Is that like following some sort of policy on how to respond to such?
All right, good afternoon. I'm Jerry Gish, and you are watching there a live news conference with Lancaster County District Attorney. And we are now starting our new newscast with that breaking news from the news conference you were just watching live right here on WGL. It's the latest on the investigation into a deadly police shooting in Lancaster. WGL News 8's Ann Shannon is here with more on what the Lancaster County District Attorney just announced. Ann?
Well, Jerry, District Attorney Heather Adams just announced that fatal shooting was justified. During a press conference, Adams shared details of the investigation, including the 911 call from Ricardo Muñoz's family on September 13th, saying he was being aggressive and struggled with mental health issues. Adams also showed the Lancaster City police officer's body cam video that was taken as he responded to the 911 call on Laurel Street. That same video was also released the day of the shooting. Adams says her investigation found that the officer feared for his life and that Muñoz immediately came after him and was chasing him with a knife at the time of the shooting.
The officer's belief that Muñoz presented an imminent threat to his life and that deadly force was necessary was beyond reasonable.
Adams says the officer fired 4 shots and Muñoz died at the scene. She added her investigation found that there was no time or opportunity for de-escalation. She also shared that she spoke with his family before releasing her findings and offered her condolences to them. WGAL News 8's Barbara Barr is at the press conference and will have continuing coverage both on air and online. Ann Shannon, WGAL News 8.
And thank you. Other news today.